America trusted Ford, and that was a mistake. 271 people killed, hundreds and hundreds more injured. If you get into a brand new Ford Explorer, you probably trust that it'll safely take you and your family wherever you need to go. But back in the late 90s, Americans had that same trust and paid the ultimate price. Ford and their tire partner Firestone were caught ignoring every warning, paying off people to stay quiet, and hiding the deadly truth about their cars from the public. So how did Ford and Firestone let something this dangerous happen? And are we even safe from something like this ever happening again? Well, going back, the American public got their first warning that something was up in 1999, when State Farm insurance investigator Sam Boyden alerted the NHTSA, or the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that the treads of the Firestone tires on Ford Explorers were essentially peeling off of the tire at highway speeds. And it was because of these disintegrating tires that hundreds of Ford Explorers were getting into horrific crashes all across the nation. Around the same time, a Houston news TV station, KHOU, put out a 7-minute long segment about these tire failures on Fords. Now, products have failures. Cars will break, tires can fail, that's normal. But this was on one of the most popular SUVs of the era, the Ford Explorer, which had sold hundreds of thousands of units and made Ford and Firestone a whole lot of money. And when the NHTSA began investigating this further, they realized that both Ford and Firestone had known about these issues for years, and not only didn't recall the car and the tire, but had been covering up the failures. Because, well, a recall would have hurt the massively growing sales of the Ford Explorer, and thus would have put a dent in Ford and Firestone's bottom line. Former head of the NHTSA, Joan Claybrook, even put out a statement saying Ford and Firestone covered up safety problems with the tire SUV combo for a decade, doubling down in the same statement with, quote, "There is no question the companies knew they had a problem, but they kept it a secret." It was pretty damning, to say the least. The head of America's highway safety team was putting Ford and Firestone on blast.
And it would have been one thing if this was a minor issue, but it wasn't. People were getting hurt and even dying in these horrific crashes. As a result, Ford and Firestone were facing a growing number of lawsuits. And understandably so, because an act of negligence on this scale can't be fought without a strong legal team. A strong legal team like Morgan & Morgan, the sponsor of today's video. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm, and it's never been easier to pick up the phone and get in touch with one of their excellent lawyers to fight your case. In the case of the Ford and Firestone failures, we had a car that was marketed to regular working class Americans like you or me, and so it was regular people getting hurt when their tires failed. Regular people who probably couldn't afford upfront legal fees, especially when they were already facing potentially massive hospital bills. Well, with Morgan & Morgan, the fee is free unless you win. All you need to do is get in touch with one of the over 1,000 lawyers at Morgan & Morgan and let them fight to get the justice you deserve. So if you've been a victim in a car accident, medical malpractice, workplace injury, or any other personal injury, you can hit the link in the description to get Morgan & Morgan to fight for you. Of course, at this point in the 90s, there still wasn't a concrete ruling as to what was going on with these Firestone tires on Fords, but the number of cases was growing rapidly.
And as these devastating failures got more and more press, we even saw whistleblowers come forward, like Bill Orr, a senior lab technician at Firestone, who raised concerns to his superiors about defect rates in their tires, but the bosses ignored him. So when they didn't listen, Bill went over their heads and alerted corporate execs and lead engineers of his findings, and 2 months later, he was fired. All of this would come to a final tipping point in the summer of 2000, when the NHTSA's investigation findings went public on August 3rd. The very next day, Sears, the nation's #1 tire retailer, said they were stopping all sales of Firestone tires immediately. And on August 9th, just 5 days after that, Firestone officially recalled 6.5 million tires in response to complaints that their tires were linked to fatal accidents, targeting all ATX, ATX2, and Wilderness AT tire models. The news of this recall spread across the world, the Firestone website crashed as droves of buyers asked for refunds and replacements. On August 12th, Ford responded to customer complaints in regards to the lack of replacement tires available by allowing dealers to swap out Firestone tires on all SUVs with any other brand they had available. But on August 13th, the very next day, Ford ran a full-page Sunday newspaper ad reassuring customers that Ford SUVs with Firestone tires on them were safe. That very same day, 2 Ford Explorers suffered blowouts in Florida. Ford was in a PR nightmare. They were desperately trying to convince customers that their cars were safe, all while fixing customer cars because they clearly weren't safe. And customers weren't sure who to believe anymore. 2 of America's most trusted companies became the biggest villains of the automotive industry, seemingly overnight. And behind the scenes, the 100-year relationship between Ford and Firestone was rapidly deteriorating. But here's the thing, this didn't happen overnight. To really understand the magnitude of this scandal, we have to understand the relationship between these 2 massive companies. And to understand that, we have to start with the very close relationship of Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone. Their story starts in 1897. People back then didn't drive cars, they drove horse and buggies. Harvey Firestone, a young tire salesman for horse carriages, visited Ohio on a business trip. And there he ran into Henry Ford, an up-and-coming automobile maker out of Detroit. Henry Ford needed a reliable supply of rubber for his horseless carriages, and Harvey Firestone was just the kind of guy that could meet his demand. So the two struck a deal. Ford would make the cars, and Firestone would supply all of the tires. A seemingly innocent business deal that would be the root of death and distress just 100 years later. But we'll get to that. In just a few years, Ford Model Ts were rolling off the assembly line equipped with only Harvey Firestone's tires. And for decades, that Ford and Firestone bond was unbreakable, both becoming automotive pioneers in their own right as their companies rose to the top. A bond so unbreakable that they actually formed a group called the Vagabonds. Led by Thomas Edison, they would travel the country in Ford caravans and camp anywhere they desired as they shared philosophies and laughs. A bond so unbreakable that Firestone's granddaughter married Ford's grandson. A bond so unbreakable that long after Henry and Harvey both died, the Ford and Firestone brands were still going strong together, all the way until the early 1990s, when Ford was about to introduce a vehicle that would define the start of a new era of American motoring, the SUV era. An era that would decimate this country. Sorry, I just miss wagons. In 1990, the Ford Explorer made its debut. It was a 5-door SUV designed to replace the 3-door Bronco, and it was one of the first SUVs to be marketed to the everyday consumer. A truck rugged enough for adventure, but comfortable enough for family road trips and soccer moms. And honestly, it was an instant hit. In the first year, it sold over 140,000 units, 282,000 units in the second year, and then over 300,000 in its third. It seemed like every driveway at the end of a cul-de-sac had either a Dodge Caravan or a Ford Explorer in its driveway. Freudian slip. Ford could barely keep up with the demand, and right there next to Ford was Firestone, equipping each SUV with tires. It had been nearly 100 years after that handshake deal, and the two companies were still going strong, riding high on the mutual success. The Explorer was the best-selling SUV for the entire decade, and an obvious cash cow for Ford. And as for Firestone, their radial ATX tires and later the Wilderness AT tire were more lucrative than they could ever imagine thanks to this partnership. By the late 90s, Ford had sold millions of Explorers, and every single one of them had tires from Firestone. What could possibly go wrong? As the Explorer's popularity began to climb during its run, subtle hints of an issue began to surface. Reports were trickling in about tire tread separation. Basically, the outer tread of these Firestone tires were just peeling off. And it wasn't just the Explorers. Ford was now using these tires on almost all of their SUVs and trucks. But what was interesting was that these first reports were mostly happening in places with very hot climates. For example, the Arizona Parks and Recreation Department was the first group in the US to raise an alarm as early as 1996. They had a bunch of Firestone tires that they were suspicious about, so they asked Firestone to come and take a look. And Firestone's response? Well, they sent out engineers to Arizona to investigate, but the conclusion was that the tires were misused. They said that the roads were too rough and that the vehicles were carrying too heavy of loads on their trips. And that, well, these tires were never designed to be used off-road or on any dirt road. That is, despite the fact that these SUVs were literally advertised as being capable off-road. So, in the end, Firestone skirted the blame. But as a token of goodwill, they replaced those tires in Arizona with heavy-duty versions. Of course, with no public announcement or disclaimer as to what happened. Job done for the finance and legal teams. But inside Firestone HQ, there were even more red flags. Internal documents showed that it wasn't actually Arizona that first sounded the alarms. It was actually a dealership in Saudi Arabia that had noticed unusually high failure rates amongst their tires on the Explorers. And Firestone had gone as far as to doing their own investigation over there in the Middle East as well. Firestone, of course, saw no blame on themselves. Saudi was hot. Tires fail, it happens. They went even as far as to say that drivers were likely letting out air before hitting the desert, which was not advised by Firestone, and a one-off situation that couldn't possibly translate anywhere else. Funny how this didn't come up when they investigated Arizona. Anyways, since Firestone saw no fault, the Ford dealership had to replace the tires themselves, selling Explorers with other tire brands straight from the dealership. And it was here that a little friction started to arise. Ford wasn't happy with dealerships spending their money to swap out brand new tires, so they asked Firestone if they knew about any other failures after Saudi, and they said, nope. It wasn't until years later, of course, when Firestone's confidential claims data had to be shared for court hearings, that the Arizona failures would be brought in front of Ford. And the craziest part is, if someone was able to put two and two together back then, maybe, just maybe, they could have caught this sooner and just recalled the tires, but they didn't. And the failures definitely didn't stop either. In 1998, a researcher uncovered documents that linked 46 deaths to Fords with Firestone tires in Venezuela. So what did Ford do? They quietly replaced the tires on trucks being sold in Venezuela. It was the fault of the Firestone tires after all, not the Ford trucks. But when people dug deeper, it turns out Firestone wasn't the only company to blame. Internal memos showed that Ford was made aware that there was a serious issue with these tires as early as January 1999. But other than a few suspicious tire swaps and quiet fixes, nothing was done. No recall, no press release, and certainly no admission of guilt. Ford even went so far as to say that all of these cases were incomparable. They said Venezuela made their own tires at a Firestone plant in their own country and probably mixed up the labeling. And as for Saudi Arabia, failures were only on the 16-inch tires, which was not the case in Venezuela. Again, Ford was pointing fingers at anyone but themselves. And brother, it gets so much worse. Ford replaced and recalled tires in 16 other countries over the course of a year before ever notifying any US officials of the issue. Why? Because recalls in other countries didn't have to be reported to the US back then, and it was much cheaper to do small recalls in countries where they sold far fewer vehicles, which also kept the press from sniffing too closely into the incidents. Ford and Firestone were essentially concealing an ongoing massacre behind closed doors. But what was actually happening? What made these tires so dangerous? In some cases, drivers would be on the highway driving away and then suddenly feel shuddering. It would feel a lot like a tire puncture, but in this case, the outer layer of the tire would literally peel off the wheel. Best case scenario, drivers would just pull over and throw on a spare or get a tow, but that was the best case scenario. American drivers weren't driving small trucks. They were driving top-heavy SUVs like the Ford Explorer. And well, a rear tire failure often resulted in losing control, or worse, flipping over. For those of you that have witnessed a tire blowout firsthand, you'll know there's not really any warning. It just happens suddenly. It's terrifying. One moment you're singing aloud to DMX's third hit album in 18 months, and then the next moment, your Ford Explorer is veering off into the next lane, or worse, there is no next moment. Eventually, hundreds of crashes, injuries, and even deaths started to get linked together. By the middle of the year 2000, the US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had received 193 complaints that involved 21 fatalities. And so, they opened an investigation into Firestone's ATX and Wilderness tires. By the end of that investigation, that number would climb so much higher. To put it bluntly, Ford and Firestone had just become a deadly combo. In fact, it was the biggest safety crisis in automotive history at the time. So investigators started looking into the facts. A specific brand of tire was failing, and more often than not, it was on specific Ford models with these tires. Yeah, Ford exclusively used Firestone tires, but Firestone tires weren't exclusively on Fords, so why weren't these deaths and incidents happening on all sorts of cars? Well, what they found was the perfect storm of bad decision-making and manufacturing problems. First was the tire design. Ford had asked Firestone to make the ATX and Wilderness AT models lighter and cheaper. Ford needed the tires to provide a softer ride and give them better gas mileage. The Explorer, after all, was a near 4,000-pound SUV with a big displacement engine, so Ford needed a way to buff the numbers of their gas guzzler. Firestone understood and obliged. Tire weight was reduced by 10%, and the second iteration of the ATX, the ATX2, used even less material than that. And well, it worked. Lighter tires improved gas mileage, and they also cost less to make. But it also meant that the margins of safety were ever so slim. For example, tires are given heat tolerance gradings, grades that determine how the tires react to stress and overheating. A C grade was the lowest allowed for public use. Firestone's new tires were developed to just make it by with a C. And while that may have gotten me through college, it wasn't very reassuring as the only thing keeping you attached to the road at 70 miles per hour. Then there was the issue of tire pressures. Yes, we should always check our tire pressures, especially before road trips, but what if I told you that Ford's recommendation was an unusually low tire pressure of 26 psi? And this was likely due to one, wanting a more cushy ride, but more importantly, to improve stability. But Firestone's own specifications were 30 to 35 psi, so if you're Ford, why would you risk it? Well, it turns out that in development testing of the Ford Explorer, they had a little issue with cars flipping over in sharp turns. And instead of re-engineering the suspension to keep the car stable, they found that a slightly lower tire pressure would keep the cars right side up, and it didn't cost them a dime. Lower tire pressure means softer sidewalls, more grip, more stability, but lower tire pressure also meant more friction. And the tires began running hotter at highway speeds. Over time, the excessive heating could cause the tires to weaken, and in this case, literally come apart at the treads. Ford had mitigated a small risk and unknowingly created a much bigger risk. The next factor was the manufacturing process. Not all tires were created equal, or in this case, they weren't even really the same tires. An unusual proportion of the failed Firestone tires were coming from one factory in Decatur, Illinois. And investigators found things like impurities in the rubber, inconsistent gluing of tire layers, and a whole lot of labor issues. The factory had just come off a huge worker strike in the mid-90s, and Ford's solution was replacing 2,300 experienced workers with newbies who were willing to get paid 30% less. One former employee even went on record saying that he wouldn't buy the tires after seeing all of the issues inside of that building, even with his employee discount. And that leads me to the final ingredient, the Ford Explorer itself, or at least the type of car that it was, an SUV. Like almost all SUVs, the Explorer had a high center of gravity and a narrow track. And a car of these dimensions was much more likely to roll over in a scenario where a sedan would just slide or come to a stop. And I have personally witnessed this exact scenario on a trip through rural Texas a few years ago. A 90s Explorer was next to me on a 2-lane section of I-45, often considered the most dangerous highway in America, by the way. Now, This Explorer was likely on a much newer set of tires, but nevertheless, its front right tire blew out and it veered into my lane. I swerved into the shoulder to avoid it, and in that moment, my first instinct was to punch the gas to get ahead because, well, hitting the brakes and being behind an out-of-control SUV sounded like a disaster. And I'm glad I did, because as I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw the Explorer veer off in the other direction, hit the guardrail, flip over, and land on its roof. The entire roof structure of that car collapsed, and the passengers didn't survive. Nearly 30 years ago, Ford and Firestone both had ample knowledge that their products were going to see unsafe failures and potentially kill people, and to this day, people are still suffering the consequences of those actions. But profits come first, and most complaints and lawsuits back then were resolved with small settlements and confidentiality agreements. But you see, all of that changed at the turn of the century with the NHTSA investigation that we started this story with. Once the news got out that Ford and Firestone were complicit in not only selling unsafe products but also covering it up, they resorted to what all couples do at the end of a relationship. They started blaming each other. Ford said the Explorer was safe on any tire, but also pointed out that there were no incidents on Explorers with Goodyear tires. The Firestone CEO publicly stated that if a tire blows out, you should be able to pull over, not roll over, implying that the real issue was with the Explorer's design. And Firestone even tried to prove it by sponsoring tests that showed how easy it was to flip an Explorer. Both companies were trying their best to throw the other under the bus, all while their customers were actually ending up under the bus, sometimes literally. And then in September of 2000, congressional committees called both parties into a hearing to plead their cases. It was showtime on Capitol Hill. The Ford and Firestone circus now had to answer to the public, and someone was gonna pay. What happened next was part safety investigation and part soap opera. In the hearings, the finger pointing went back and forth like an episode of Maury. Firestone's defense was that their tires worked fine when they were used properly, and that the Ford Explorer didn't use them properly. Ford, on the other hand, had a very different message. Quote, "There's nothing much to see here, except some very bad tires." Ford's CEO insisted time and time again that this issue is a tire issue and a tire issue only. They showed the courts that they had millions of Explorers now on Goodyear tires, and well, those weren't failing. And Ford brought up everything from Saudi Arabia to Decatur, Illinois. At one point, Representative Billy Tozin presented internal Firestone data that implied Firestone knew of these tire issues as early as 1992. The theme of the day seemed to be, you knew and did nothing? Well, not quite nothing, because we did get a couple of half-hearted apologies. Firestone's CEO said, quote, "I come before you to apologize to you, the American people, and especially to the families who have lost loved ones in these terrible rollover accidents. I also come to accept full and personal responsibility on behalf of Firestone for the events that led to this hearing." And then, in the same breath, "However, you will have my word that we will continue until we find the cause." You are the cause, dude. Once again, they were displacing blame. Okay, all right. Now Ford's CEO's apology. Just kidding, there wasn't one. Ford doubled down about being misled by Firestone and explained that any outside settlement with families were reached without any findings of liability on their part. 271 innocent people dead, and somehow nobody was to blame. The whole spectacle made for great headlines, though. Two top-tier American automotive companies battling over who was the bigger villain. Meanwhile, the victims' families were in those hearings, and it was thanks to them that the public could see through the fog of corporate denial. And in the end, the verdict was clear. Washington stated that both Ford and Firestone shared the blame. The tires were failing, and the vehicle was unable to handle those failures. And well, for Firestone, the financial and reputational hit was as swift as it was crushing. By late 2000, their stock value had plummeted as they were facing a wave of lawsuits and recall costs. In hopes to turn over a new leaf, they fired their top executives and then shut down the Decatur, Illinois plant for good. As for Ford, they also showed a few executives the door as the rest of Ford scrambled to replace the tires on millions of SUVs. And then in May of 2001, Firestone formally announced that it was cutting all ties with Ford, ending their constant supply of tires for the first time since that handshake deal between Harvey and Henry. It was the divorce of the century and a very messy one at that, and as big of an industry shakeup as this was, nobody was surprised. All the mutual trust went out the window when the blame game started. Ford's CEO Jacques Nasser stated that it was sad that our long-standing relationship had ended, while the chairman of Bridgestone, Firestone's parent company, remarked that relationships, like tires, sometimes wear out. Bars. And then, in October of 2000, the US Congress passed the Transportation Recall Enhancement, Accountability, and Documentation Act, aka the TREAD Act. Those lawmakers love their acronyms as much as they love their government shutdowns, and this law forced automakers and equipment manufacturers to promptly report safety issues discovered overseas and to share warranty claim data, significantly speeding up the identification of potential defects. And this TREAD Act is also the same reason why that one light on your dash is always on, because it mandated TPMS sensors in all new cars. And even the designs of SUVs changed thanks to this scandal. Ford had to redesign the Explorer for 2002 with a long list of safety upgrades. Lower center of gravity, wider track, independent rear suspension, and electronic stability control. Oh, and higher recommended tire pressures, 30 psi now to be exact. And pretty much every tire maker also hunkered down and improved quality control across the board. Firestone's public humiliation was enough of a lesson for everyone else. Speaking of, Firestone now hired a chief quality officer for the first time ever, and Ford execs made a vow to never hide problems, to always address them head on. I can't really speak on how that held up, but it's safe to assume that they learned that cover-ups are just way too expensive. And as for the families, hundreds of wrongful death and injury lawsuits were settled, with some cases even reaching trial and resulting in multi-million-dollar judgments. It apparently cost Firestone a total of $1.67 billion and Ford over $500 million. And that doesn't even factor in the 50% drop in Bridgestone's market cap or the billions spent restructuring the company in the fallout. But the real damage was unfixable. Families were left broken, incomplete, 271 people killed and more than 500 injured. And that's just the US, 46 reported dead in Venezuela, and maybe many more in other countries that were never investigated. Now, over 20 years later, both Ford and Bridgestone are worth more than they have ever been, and while it's impossible to put a dollar amount to the loss of life they caused, it does seem like they got off kinda easy. Of course, everyone's barometer for justice is different, and I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments what you think, but perhaps the most important thing is that actions were taken to make sure that this doesn't happen again. From the TREAD Act to the more active enforcement by the NHTSA, there are greater barriers in place to keep manufacturers accountable for endangering people. And these barriers have undoubtedly saved lives since. But despite that, those same Ford Explorers and other potentially dangerous early SUVs remain on the road today. And I still have harrowing flashbacks of seeing that Explorer crash, those people die right in front of my eyes. So the next time you have to rotate your tires or your TPMS light goes off or you get a recall notice, remember that these things only exist because regular people like you and me potentially lost their lives in the fight for accountability after companies like Ford and Firestone abandoned them. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, then you'll love this video that I picked out just for you. And you can join these members and patrons by pressing join next to the subscribe button and get early access to videos and exclusive behind the scenes content. I'll see you in the next one.